Good evening and welcome back to Bookmark, our series where I give a little précis of a book that I have read and recommend and enjoy, and perhaps you'll either research it for yourself or perhaps obtain a copy, or maybe at least give you the gist of what the book includes so that you may or may not be so disposed to go and purchase or read for yourself. Tonight, the book that we're reading is a book called The Heart's Time. It's written by Janet Morley, and the subtitle is A Poem a Day for Lent and Easter. It's by SPCK. It came out in 2011. It's got roughly 160 pages. And basically what it does is to choose the author, Janet Morley, who's a spiritual writer and spiritual director, worked for Christian Aid for some time, a wonderful writer, where she takes some of her favourite poems and then gives a bit of a commentary for the next page or two on why she's chosen. And it's a book that I've used over several years now in the Lenten season and at Easter. So let me give you just a little flavour of what it involves. I'm going to read certain portions. I'm going to summarise 10 points that she makes, and then we'll have a sample of it. We'll read a poem and her commentary on it. So let me read what Janet Morley says in her introduction. She says this: poetry and the spiritual life. And then she quotes a poem from Nicholas Albury, who says this: to know a poem by heart is to slow down to the heart's time. And that's the name of the book. And then this paragraph that she says, which is full of wisdom. Reading poetry offers a distinctive resource for our spiritual life. And this is true of a wide variety of poems. Some, but not all, of the poems in this book have been written with a consciously religious intention. Others have not, but have been selected because they are addressing in a truthful and productive way matters that Christians can helpfully reflect on. Their brief and vivid form makes poems infinitely usable, and the very process of engaging with poetry is valuable in the spiritual journey. Over the next couple of pages in that introduction, Janet Morley makes 10 points. Now, I'm going to streamline them down to their basics, but if you want to read behind the scenes, you'll find a wee bit more detail and wisdom. But these 10 points are worth keeping in mind for this book and for poetry in general in relation to the spiritual life. So very briefly, point 1, poetry makes us slow down. It makes for meditative reading, which is close to prayer, rather than the fact that so often now when we're reading things on a screen or the newspaper or whatever, we tend to quickly scan them to kind of get the guts of what we want to say or have read. And often we can miss much of the treasures of the important details. So poetry, like prayer, makes us slow down. Secondly, poetry helps us face the realities of the human condition. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time we do deal in superficialities or the immediate moment. We skate the surface of life. But sometimes, somewhere, someone has the task of getting us to slow down and to go deep. And that's what poetry at its best can do. And therefore we look at the realities, some of the very difficult realities about ourselves and others and the world around us, the world in the round, and we face those realities, and poetry has a particular knack of making us or helping us to reflect on those more thoughtfully, more contemplatively. Third, people need and cling to what she calls patterned words. And that's what poetry provides. Every word is carefully chosen, and the sequence and the phraseology and even the sound and the rhyme or even the semi-rhyme, all of that beat and rhythm, choosing patterned words is extremely important, and poetry manages to condense and distill that. And that's why it's so valuable, so very invaluable. Fourth point, poetry is free to be partial, to investigate just one part of the truth. Now, no one statement, no one book, no one life can encompass all of reality and every truth, but poetry has a particular task and gift in managing to convey one aspect of a greater truth. and dwell on the details. And that's a wonderful gift. And often by slowing down and getting in close with close attentive detail, it helps us to probe one aspect or one truth of the greater truth, so to speak. Poetry does that. Fifth, poetry notices and highlights fine details, which is close to what I said in the last one. It's very good at looking at the inner landscape of our soul, our mind, our heart, our emotions, but also the outer landscape, so to speak, nature poetry, built environments, the relationships around us. It notes and highlights those particular details. Point 6. Poetry leaves a good deal of room for the reader to appreciate different layers of meaning. You know, you've got the heart, you've got the head, and you've got the spirit. You've got those layers of meaning. So it's not just one particular way of saying something or conveying it. It tries to be holistic and engage the whole person and on particular levels. And that kind of reinforces the message or the meaning or the perspective, so to speak. Seventh, images evoked by a poem or by its sounds and phrases linger in the mind as a remembered melody or a future resource. I love her evoking of the fact that poetry is like a remembered melody. And I know in my life I've had the experience lots of poetry or phrases that were kind of instilled into me in the past. My dad loved poetry and often quoted it, and I maybe picked up that from him. But I remember in school a very impressive teacher who engaged and deepened my love of poetry and appreciation for what it can do and mean. Lots of things that I have committed to memory from the past still reoccur, and they're treasures and the resources still to use. And not just to use in a sort of pragmatic sense, but actually just to feed and enrich. They beautify and they enlighten and uplift. So I love that gift-like quality that it has, a remembered melody. Point 8. Poems can make the familiar strange and help us both unlearn bad habits and learn better insights. So poetry has got that educational, that constructive way of building ourselves up, that weeds out and tills and nurtures for the future. Point 9. Poetry is a profound way to engage in prayer, or at least consider it in a fresh way. Sometimes, maybe for most of us, prayer can be one of those duties and chores that becomes very dry and one-dimensional. And poetry can manage to give us insights and phrases and treasures and remembered melodies that can refresh and inspire all over again. And think of how much of Scripture is written in poetic form, not just the Psalms and the Proverbs, but prophets, Jesus himself, the apostles. Amidst all the prose, there's a fair bit of poetry or poetic-like language. And even in the laws and the commandments, there's a fair bit of poetry worked into. So it's there. And that takes us on to point 10, the last one. Poets often mine the Bible for images, stories, and language that can cast new light on our shared tradition or our inherited writings. So there is a deep connection between the Bible, the spiritual life, and poetry. A lot of poetry is not explicitly religious, it's agnostic, maybe even atheistic, but it's amazing how much poetry over the years, and even to this day and beyond, still dips into that reservoir of remembered melodies, that collective memory that there is in the biblical literature, which still funds the mind and the heart and the spirit and the soul. So those are 10 really worthwhile points keeping in mind. Let me round that section off briefly by quoting a final paragraph after those 10 points, and Morley says this. So poetry offers us a way of being truly experimental in our spiritual life. It gives us a chance to address God more boldly, to test out our beliefs, to examine our vocation, to acknowledge our capacity for self-delusion, and to give voice to our deepest longings. Poetry can manage to address or attempt to address all of those very rich and enriching things. And the last thing I want to do here, or the second last thing I want to do, is to quote a poem It's called Lent. It's by Jean M. Watt, and this is Friday of the first week in Lent. This is a few days past now. I'm going to read the poem and then give you a sample of what Morley says as commentary. Lent is a tree without blossom, without leaf, barer than blackthorn in its winter sleep, all unadorned. Unlike Christmas, which decrees the setting up, the dressing up of trees, Lent is a taking down, a stripping bare, a starkness after all has been withdrawn of surplus and superfluous, leaving no hiding place, only an emptiness, between black branches a most precious space before the leaf, before the time of flowers, lest we should see only the leaf, the flower, lest we should miss the stars. That's Lent by Jean M. Watt. And this is the commentary by Morley in her book. In the Northern Hemisphere, our experience of Lent and its traditional practices is strongly linked with what is normally happening in terms of the weather and the progression of the seasons. Unless Easter is very late or spring exceptionally early, the start of Lent falls at a time that is still cold and wintry, before most of the buds and shoots have even begun to stir. However, at Easter, spring is definitely coming, and the first flowers of the year are blooming and leaves are emerging as if to greet the resurrection. Many poets mine the season of spring for metaphors of the spiritual life. Morley says this poem, interestingly, celebrates that cold space at the start of Lent, when trees and bushes are still bare and unadorned, and links this to the practice of abstinence, of stripping down to the basics. Although it speaks of a time that is cold and exposed, the mood is not gloomy. There is even a certain gentleness about the blackthorn in its winter sleep. Blackthorn is the first tree to flower, and the white flowers come before the leaves do, so that its first snowy blossoms are sometimes called a blackthorn winter. The poem contrasts this time of stripping bare with the Christmas festival, which ordains that trees shall be set up and dressed extravagantly. Many find that there is a certain austere pleasure in clearing up after the excesses of Christmas and taking on the disciplines of Lent, giving up the surplus and superfluous, as the poem puts it. The second half of the poem explores what is at the heart of doing without decoration. It is both challenging and inspiring. There is no hiding place, but the emptiness is a most precious space that deserves to be noticed in its own right. Morley says, I was expecting the poem to highlight the elegant, essential structure of the branches and shape of trees that can only be seen before the leaves and blossom emerge. But the poet's last line mentions instead what can only be seen when the branches are bare, the distant stars now caught in the twigs, which will be hidden from view and eclipsed when the leaves are thick and the blossom flaunting itself. Suddenly the whole perspective of the poem has shifted from close inspection of blackthorn hedges and Christmas trees to the vastness of the universe. In the same way, we are invited to allow the intentional keeping of Lent to rearrange our habitual perspectives on life, to let our selves be unsettled so that we do not miss God's wider vision. A sample and quote from Janet Morley, The Heart's Time, a poem a day for Lent and Easter. There's ample time for you yet to purchase a copy, however you do so, or maybe dip into it in the future. And just by way of information, Janet Morley has written a companion volume. It's called Haphazard by Starlight, and this one is a poem a day for Advent to Epiphany, from Advent to Epiphany. It's a different season, but with the same way of quoting poems and then having a commentary. So those two books by Janet Morley, but especially at this time of year, The Heart's Time, well worth dipping into as a resource to enjoy on its own, but also to help you in your life of prayer. and the life of the Spirit. Thanks for tuning in, and next week we will dip into another book that I have chosen to share and recommend. In the meantime, God bless.